The Echo Chamber, brought to you by The Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers. Sponsored by The Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Echo Chamber. I'm Maya Pawinska-Sims, EMEA editor of The Holmes Report, and I'm joined in London today by Steve Earl and Howard Kosky. Steve runs Zeno in Europe and has long been a close observer of media change as he came to the agency world from a background in journalism. Been working in content creation and running agencies for 25 years. Since you're a child, obviously. He's also written a couple of books on the risks and rewards of digital media and its evolution. Howard is founder and CEO of broadcast specialist Marketeers 4DC, which recently launched 4DC as a dedicated podcast strategy business. So we thought it was about time you appeared front of mic, H, especially since today we're going to be doing a podcast about podcasts. So we're trying not to go too meta and eat ourselves on this one, but chaps, welcome to the Echo Chamber.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So to start, Steve, I'll kick off with you. Why are podcasts flavour of the month for comms and PR agencies and their clients at the moment?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure they are. I mean, we've had podcasts for a long time now. We've had this kind of content become, more and more popular, more and more people downloading, listening to. You never know quite what someone's listening to when you see them on the train, but I'll bet in a lot of cases it is podcasts, particularly when you can't hear the tinny music coming out of the earphones. But I think of late we've seen a jump in quality, although it's very broad. Some podcasts are still too, I think, self-serving and far from the mark. But I think it's also partly that people are in the age of fake news and very transient, snackable media, lots of content whizzing past our eyes. People want something that they can really get their heads around and spend more time thinking about. So it's a little like the rise of long-form written content. People want to really think about what they're consuming in more depth. And most people like me, I'm sure you spend your whole time looking at a screen, looking at a little phone, and you actually want to give your eyes a rest and use your ears instead.
So tell me a little bit more about that fake news context. How is a podcast going to get around that as far as a brand or an organisation is concerned?
Well, I think that partly it's the format. It's more intimate. It's more authentic. People trust it a lot more. Of course, any form of content, whether it's spoken word, written word, images, moving images, they can all be manipulated in some way. That's always been the case. So anything can fundamentally be fake, but podcasts are typically trusted. Authentic, and it's a different kind of experience for the person consuming them than just looking at small snippets of text-based news.
H, what about you? What's your view on why podcasts are so popular at the moment? I mean, you're inundated with people asking for them.
A number of reasons. One, I think it's a bit of fashion. It's a new shiny toy. The cynical people say that slightly. If I look at a lot of it, I think that whilst radio is very popular and its listening habits are holding true the radio stats, I think what it demonstrates is an appetite for speech. I think if you look at what's happening in the UK, especially with Global Radio's music policy, a lot of the commercial radio network, I think a lot of listeners are just getting a bit bored of the same music tracks hour after hour and like speech. And yes, whilst radio stations do contribute to the podcast market, I think, as Steve said, the eyes are burning from video. It's the commute, it's housework, it's portable, it's everything that it's radio on demand, and everything that radio was just happens to be packaged under something called podcasting at the moment, because it's on demand and available through your smartphone, and it's accessible whenever you want it. So I think listeners are still in love with radio, but consuming it, as Steve said, in bite-sized chunks when they want, where they want, and through smartphone devices.
I mean, we're talking about bite-sized and snackable, but actually I see a parallel with like the rise of the long read in journalism as well. That actually it's snackable, but you can also go in depth in a podcast and have quite an in-depth discussion between a host and a guest that can go can go quite deep. That maybe it's kind of beyond radio in the same way as a long read is sort of beyond a classic feature in a newspaper.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of stats, I mean, consumption rates at the moment, you'll see different reports in the UK ranging at 24 minutes. Which is,
That's amazing.
Strong, yeah. But you need to consider that if people are on a commute wherever you are in the UK, or at home pottering around, 24 minutes is not a long period of time compared to 2 seconds of a 30-second video, or scrolling through your smartphone. So 24 minutes, I totally understand, because if your commute is a half an hour, 40 minutes, it's an easy listen. In the States, they're saying, I've seen some reports on some days saying consumption rate is now 50 minutes.
What, a day?
No, per podcast.
Per podcast? Yeah. Wow. That's astonishing, though, particularly if there's any kind of branded.
But if you say it's astonishing, if you said, I don't know if you listen, I listen to the radio in the morning.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I listen to the radio on my drive in, it's 45 minutes.
So does it go in one ear and out the other? Is that what you're saying? I mean, how do you assess whether
podcast is slightly different because it's a positive press to play download.
Right. Okay.
In other words, it's not just background. I've made a selective decision. I want to listen to that, and there's effort required. So the brain subconsciously has selected to listen.
Yeah.
But the point I'm stressing is my drive-in is 45 minutes. Well, what else am I going to do? I'm not going to listen to the radio for 3 minutes.
Yeah.
It's illegal to then watch a video. If I were to watch a video,
yeah.
I'm not going to read a newspaper. So, it's slightly passive, but and obviously because of technology in car through Bluetooth, podcast listening in car is on the increase. So it doesn't surprise me. The bit that shocks people is because you're comparing it to the view of a video potentially.
True.
In other words, that video was 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 30 seconds, but we all know that after 2 seconds, but if you think about more the environment of which you're listening.
Yeah.
So if I'm in London on a train or a bus, if I'm around the rest of the country in the car on my commute, if my commute is half hour plus, is it inconceivable I'd listen for 24 minutes?
Yeah.
No.
Mm-hmm. I think another really interesting point about it is podcasts as a format and the kind of editorial bent we're seeing around the titles and the concepts for podcast content is that you can go really, really niche with it as well. So in a way, I think back to trade magazines in the 80s and 90s, and there were hundreds of them, and they were for some really obscure topics, and obviously a lot of those aren't around today. But some podcasts are for very, very niche topics, stuff that just simply couldn't be covered by a mainstream magazine. Because they're for people to get sweaty about in private, to use a terrible turn of phrase. So what stuff do I download and listen to? I look at, I'm a cycling nut. I'll listen to some really obscure content about, the history of Italian componentry and stuff like that. And okay, I enjoy it, but it's from a brand perspective. It's really interesting that firstly, that a format for that content exists and is commercially viable, but also I'm listening because I'm genuinely interested. It might be that I listen to it in the car, or it might be I do get a bit sweaty and I save it up for next Wednesday's train commute. So
tell me a little bit about the emotional connection between the listener and the podcast. We've talked about it a little bit. I mentioned it's quite an intimate experience. It can feel like you're having quite an authentic listen. It's unfiltered to a certain extent, beyond being anything libelous, hopefully being edited out, and it's not polished. It's not necessarily completely on message. I mean, tell me a bit about, in terms of why somebody might want to listen to a bit of content that's produced by a brand or a company or organisation, as opposed to just reading something in the press about what they're doing in that area.
I can't be polished or on message now, can I?
Do your best.
I think the because it is that one-to-one format, because you're putting headphones on or in, and you're choosing to sit down and making that conscious decision rather than it just kind of coming across your ears or your eyes, it's different as a result. And so there is more of an intimate relationship. I know it's not real, but you feel that way with the person you're talking to.
PR's all about, right? It's relationships with public. So podcast is, in theory, a perfect channel for that.
Yeah. I mean, you the world of football. Gary Neville, whatever you may think of him when he's a pundit on screen, when at half time, his podcasts are really popular. So maybe he has got a voice for radio or a face for radio, but people like that, I think are great at hosting podcasts because people trust their opinions and they really want to hear from them, and it's much more about the individual than the brand, really, in the way that leader columns or critics who have a really strong following because they're great restaurant writers or whatever it might be, their content gets consumed because of who they are and because of the way in which they approach. Think of a Giles Corran, for example, the way they approach their editorial as opposed to the content itself. It's partly about the person that's doing the speaking as well as the words.
And would you add anything to that, H, in terms of what's special about podcasts in terms of other types of media consumption and content?
I think Steve has covered a lot of it. I think it's taking everything that is very successful about radio, all the research that's done by the RAB and others. There is a trust with radio and the radio presenter. You don't believe the presenter has an agenda. Yeah. You believe the presenter is your friend. That and the popularity at the moment are conversational style podcasts. Yeah. Like this, sitting around a microphone, individuals having a conversation.
Having a chat.
And when you say why are they so popular, it's about the relevance to the audience. This will be popular amongst some, not amongst others. It's about because the listener will choose to want to listen to it. You'd hope they're slightly engaged at the point they've decided to download to listen. And as long as we're doing a half-decent job at interesting, informative, entertaining, honest, then I think it works. So the key thing is, just because we're not regulated by Ofcom or a global broadcaster trying to restrict what we do and do not say, the key thing is brands in the main, good brands at the moment aren't abusing that freedom of opportunity and providing interesting information that people want to listen to.
So tell me what 4DC are doing. Why have you set up as kind of a separate podcast strategy division to marketeers, which is hosting us today and does the production side and the studio side brilliantly? Why the need for something before someone even gets in the studio in terms of counsel?
It was through a fear of where the PR market was approaching podcasting, because its default was we want to produce, and if you look at how many companies will produce a TV series or a magazine, you need a level of bravery and commitment to produce. So the default for me, is just because it's fashion, you don't have to do it. So the reason for 4DC as a consultancy is marketeers the studios are a facility. We're not producing this. You are Homesport is the producer. We are an enabler for the recording. But actually, if you're a brand and an organisation, it could be there are podcasts that already exist in the market that are serving the need that you're trying to fulfil. Now, unless you are committed to want to compete with that or believe you have a space to compete with that, part of it could be try and be involved in the existing incumbents as a guest, do in-reads, sponsorship, wraps, whatever you need to do to be involved in what already exists. The default should not always be produce a podcast. It could be that the podcast landscape already is mature for the subject matter and area you want to be in. So your best strategy would be, how do I work with those existing producers and existing properties rather than produce? And because sometimes we won't produce it, even if the solution of part of the strategy is you may want to produce, it could be more drama based. It could be more entertainment based and not straight speech. In which case, that's not marketeers.
Right. Okay.
So our the way we operate, slightly independent, is to make sure that the documentation that comes out, we can say to a client, in this instance, to reach that particular audience, dear client, you shouldn't be producing your own unless you have a bravery and commitment to do this.
Yeah.
We recommend in the first instance, once having audited the landscape of where your listeners currently listen, I would recommend you try and partner up with incumbents who already have the audience base.
So you talked a bit earlier before we came in the studio about how the olden days of Procter & Gamble kind of bookending drama with their own ads. Kind of going back to
soap operas. I believe it was 1954. That's why they call soap operas. If I was P&G, you think about the portfolio of product they have available and the amount of money they currently spend in the ad world. Do I believe it's inconceivable that they should not create a series of drama, audio-based programming that resonates with their audience groups, whichever product suites they were, that becomes available and that podcasts become the regular channel for engagement with audience.
It's really interesting.
But someone like P&G has the pockets to be committed enough. Whether they're brave enough, you hear a lot from P&G about innovative marketing solutions and trying things different, and we've got to get cut through. I'm yet to see, completely innovative podcast strategy from them, because at the moment the formulae for how to run a product is quite machine-like.
And Steve, just speaking from the agency point of view, your clients must be coming to you the whole time going, on a podcast. I mean, what's those points about both commitment and boldness and bravery? What's your kind of do you just say, yeah, we'll take that brief, or is there a bit more give and take on whether that's the right solution for that client?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of give and take. It tends to be a fairly lengthy discussion, actually. I mean, so our Three Monkeys Zeno team in the UK has just been doing some research into the spoken word and the impact that it has on reputation, emerging technologies, platforms, just to really get to grips with this a bit more. So we've looked at things like voice search and how that may or may not evolve. Obviously, many factors there, but we're trying to really just understand a little bit more about voice and it really being an underutilised area of communication, particularly for B2B clients. So we'll always look at it in a fairly expansive way. But I think a couple of things there. One, we're trying to advise clients and working with Howard and his team, of course, to really understand and get the technical expertise we need to around this and learn from that experience as well, so that we're making the right recommendations on what works and what doesn't. But also just thinking about the client and its own communications challenges often as well. And one of the things that I think is interesting with any area of comms, but particularly with podcasts, is that you can get I call them the sort of fringe benefits. So you're doing a podcast series, you're working with executives and guests and maybe influencers that you're pulling in to help produce and deliver that content, and you end up having conversations with execs and finding out things that you wouldn't have found out through other means. So then we have the content, it's approved, we produce it into a podcast, and we can use it across all manner of other comms as well. It might be long-form content for LinkedIn or Medium. It might be something that becomes a campaign in its own right. So often it's a great fringe benefit technique for mining other content.
So I'm quite interested. I mean, I presume there's a little bit of ego sometimes involved on the part of the CEO execs who think, I want a podcast, I can do a podcast. You don't want everyone thinking they can just spraff on about anything for half an hour, right? I mean, what advice do you give, to both of you? When would you say that's maybe not the right solution? And kind of steer them away from something which obviously has lots of benefits for a brand if it's done properly, but can also be, what's the risk factors in doing a podcast badly?
Well, like an area of comms, you looked after, it's as simple as that, or it falls flat very quickly. I mean, so I think, firstly, I think things have moved on a little in that blogging in particular, but also social media has made execs less prone to vanity publishing and just talking to themselves across various channels. So I think they tend to take a more considered view of it these days. Also, to Howard's earlier point about you need to make sure that you're able to commit to this and really be a publisher brand in what you deliver. I think if you talk to most execs and show them the time commitment required to actually do this, they might be dissuaded from doing it just for their own ego. So you've got to do it right or not at all. So I think those are big factors in it overall. But of course, I mean, it's like any agency, I'm sure, will have clients I've had over the years where it may not be the best spokesperson that wants to get into the media, but it's the person with the biggest ego, and you have to work through that and manage that. But I think most people in the communications teams are wise to that, and they want to really understand that this will work before they let their execs loose on it.
What would you say, Howard, to that?
Yeah, I mean, the risk of doing a bad one is you make a lot of noise at the outset to launch something, and you've completely mismanaged the expectations of your stakeholders.
Right. Or whether they want to listen to it in the first place, presumably.
Yeah, but I mean, if the word that been mentioned a lot here is publisher. You are if you decide to produce, you are a publisher. I'm yet to see someone make a big noise to launch a magazine and do one.
Okay.
If you do one and it fails, the market talks about the magazine that failed.
Yeah.
So the commitment piece is key. And I think, unfortunately, people are underestimating because at the moment it's not seen as high barriers to entry to produce at different levels. People are testing, and it's very dangerous. If you test the wrong way, the fallout can be very negative because you damage the longer term opportunity because stakeholders internally and brand go, it didn't work. Well, it's not that the format doesn't work of a channel marketing of podcasting. It's just that the approach that was taken wasn't invested in correctly in audit and insight at the outset.
So how do you test and measure whether a podcast has been a success?
Depends who you talk to. To Steve's point, depends if it's a vanity piece, we'll say downloads. If a metric is downloads of a podcast, well, how much do you want to put in digital spend behind it? Because that on its own can drive your downloads, whether anyone listens to it or not. From a 4DC perspective, we do objective quant data analysis after 3 episodes normally, which is we take a sample of 100 plus of the listeners against a pre-agreed set of questions with our client to establish brand sentiment, likelihood of recommendation, and some objective analysis that says it has or hasn't worked. Actually, 9 times out of 10, not all positive. We tend to find that we learn that actually, certain elements are very successful, but certain elements we can do better. But then the other element, depending on how you're approaching podcasting, is that if you're doing in-reads, The Economist, I know, is a big advertiser through in-reads in the podcast world. They offer a text link through the in-read for free subscription trial.
Right, okay.
Now, they've just renewed, not through us, but I'm aware that they've committed to podcast advertising for another 12, 18 months.
Because it's working,
because the targeting of the in-read ads against the audience group is very highly targeted. It's a very effective in-read ad where there is an absolute metric call to action of text this number for free subscription, and they see spikes.
Okay.
So it depends on what route, depends on what your expectation is, but the way you measure is against the expectation at the outset. Some brands are doing this because they want brand sentiment or noise or awareness. So for a lot of brands, if you look at the US market, which is about 5 years ahead, the brands that are big into podcasting were what we would define as disruptor brands, where they didn't necessarily have the big pounds to go TV, DOH, and other media that requires a huge investment. But in a slightly less crowded market in podcasting, they recognise that actually, put my money in that, I get a greater share of noise. Yeah. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Harry's, the razor company in the US, are one of the biggest advertising and brands around podcasting for very obvious reasons. Gillette are not.
Yeah.
So when you've got a slightly embryonic market and you've got a particular audience base of a certain profile of age group and style, smartphone users, then actually, if you're the right brand, this is the right environment. And if you approach it in the right way, you get very effective results that are very easy to measure. My concern for a lot in the PR industry is the measurement is not a consideration at the outset. It's we want to produce this without really thinking through what they're going to do to ensure the measurement provides an end result that everyone can hang their hat on.
Steve, you're nodding viciously there.
Vicious?
Fierce nodding.
That's not bad.
It sounds like you'd agree with that sometimes it's kind of, you haven't started, clients don't always start with the end in mind, right? How do you put some checks and balances in place to ensure they've got the right objectives from doing that particular bit of channel marketing and that it drives value for the brand, and then you're proving to them afterwards that it has in fact achieved those objectives.
Yeah, well, absolutely, that focus on measurement and really looking long and hard and digging deep into how you can measure it. So it's not just about downloads unless it's vanity. You're really trying to understand why people care about it. Because if someone's chosen to download some content and they've set aside some personal time to listen to it, normally it's because they actually care and they want to do it rather than they feel they have to. So how can you tap into that and measure the value or the potential value of that? So you need to focus on it properly, not just sort of rush into it. I think that's important. But then the other thing that I think is going to be an emerging area is not co-curated or created content, but because you can ask people questions once they've downloaded a few podcasts, because you can get some feedback from them, because they really care or presumably care, you can work with them to potentially shape the content you put into future podcasts. So rather than just setting up 12 months worth of podcast content in advance, you can really shape it by understanding the audience reaction, understanding what they want from more content that you provide, and that means that they're even more likely to be engaged with it and listen more in the future. And then so it's not just measurement in terms of this is something we're doing as a new initiative and we've got to justify the investment and show why it's paid back for the brand, but we can, in an iterative sense, learn from this and we can develop ever better content. So it becomes a 360-degree part of our insights, strategy, creative, content development, production and measurement process, rather than just measurement so that someone gives it a thumbs up.
So you're doing that whole testing, learning, tweaking, making it better, achieving more.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think as looking at other forms of media content, if you're in print, what is the engagement really? I remember working in newspapers years ago. Letters to the editor, half of them are made up. Let's be honest. So what real feedback do you actually get?
I've never
fundamentally
done that.
No, of course.
Any of the trade publications
the Holmes Report would, of course. But how legitimate is that feedback? And you look at the feedback on social. How can you really pick the bones out of that? If people care about podcasts, they will care, I'm sure, about the feedback they're giving, and that will allow you to create something that is more engaging. It becomes more of a dialogue. Funny enough, given that it's a one-way form of content. In essence, people should give feedback on it. I know a lot of people who listen to podcasts and then will talk to each other about the content and form views on it, and it's a little bit like when I was a child and there were only 3 TV channels and you'd watch Blackadder and then natter about it the next morning because you found it funny. You don't get that in the era of Netflix in quite the same way, but you do with podcasts.
Yeah, apart from Line of Duty, of course. There is still appointment television.
Who has a podcast?
I know they do.
And that's an interesting part is the BBC, if you watch Line of Duty, at the very end of the episode, prompt the viewer to download the podcast.
All the conspiracy theories on the podcast. The BBC are doing a bit of podcasting, aren't they? Well, they've got their BBC Sounds thing. Sounds app.
Best use of £100 million worth of licence fee.
Is that working? Did we need that post iPlayer? I'm not sure we did. But they've got some interesting content on it. But that's a big investment they've made into.
Huge investment.
Let's chuck a load of cash at wrapping stuff as a podcast.
Well, the idea, I think, with the app is it's everything in one place. And so, you used to have music, and now it's and podcasts. Yeah. It's they've, who are they trying to compete with? Question mark. Yeah. Is it a Spotify? is it an Amazon? But it's a fascinating one. There is something that's quite unreported at the moment because there was a lot of hoo-ha around Google. They would change the way that podcasts were being done so they weren't visible to Google. Right. They didn't want Google to be able to monetize people searching for and various other things. But it's interesting, there is a podcast that's been produced by BBC Studios with Spotify called Beyond the Clash.
Right. What's that about? Which
kind of went under the radar in the media world. But it's fascinating because Spotify, who I would argue are one of probably the most aggressive companies globally in podcasting in general, and I wouldn't back against them, should we say, have done a deal where they've used BBC back catalogue content.
Right.
Which opens up a much wider conversation because the BBC's asset as a national treasure is millions of hours worth of interviews and content, yet have made a podcast with Spotify.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, Desert Island Discs was kind of one of the original podcasts, if you package it up like that.
They've now got Desert Island Dish, haven't they? Their foodie podcast.
Yes.
There you go. How creative was that?
Very, very creative. So tell me about the importance of really well thought through distribution strategy of podcasts. It's not about going to the studio, recording 40 minutes of absolutely cracking content, which is very on brand, or whichever the organisation behind it is. It can't just stop there. You've got to think about how you reach your audience, like with any bit of channel marketing. What's best practice in that area?
Well, I think Howard's best place to talk about the technical side of it, but I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and they made the point that if you can't distribute a podcast or that content properly, it's a bit like having a great corporate magazine or a brand-funded magazine that you print. And then you just hand it out on reception, and you don't actually get it into anyone's hands. It's ridiculous, and so that distribution obviously needs to go hand in hand with production and the editorial content and the way you measure the value of it.
So how do we do this well, H? What's the best strategy for good distribution to get it into the maximum number of target ears?
The first port of call is to make sure you have buy-in from the business.
Right.
So most organisations or brands that are producing them, it's recommended that before you even do that, you understand what other channel marketing routes there are within the organisation that can support the promotion of. So through DM, CRM, if there's a portal, any other mechanisms. But then in terms of the upload and where you sit, you want maximum visibility. So you can go onto different aggregators that exist in the market, but in essence you want to be visible to iTunes, Apple Music, Spotify, SoundCloud, Podbean, the list goes on. But then think about the audiogram. Think about the thumbnail and visibility, because again, we spoke about this, speech-based search for podcasts in the US is almost 50% now.
Is it really?
Yep. It's growing in the UK, not quite nearly 50%, but at the point at which I say, Alexa, podcast on bedtime stories, well, if I'm if I was Cowangate, I could distribute this through my media buy across digital, so it could be that I cross-promote. I've done a series around bedtime stories targeting mums with newborn babies, So my traditional digital inventory, can you add a link to download, as well as making sure it's accessible through all formats, all devices. But then recognise speech-based search is increasing. So what are you doing to make sure that the podcast is visible to speech-based search? Because there's no reason why you can't sit alongside BBC's bedtime stories. This is what we said at the start. This is the production is almost the semantics. It's not Field of Dreams. It's not if you build it, they will come. That's my real fear. Is the expectation is we'll produce a podcast because we want to produce a podcast. Yeah. But then people aren't really thinking that actually, if I said to you, I remember years and years ago going to someone spoke to me about sponsorship, and that the amount the actual paying the sponsorship, the multiple of that value you then have to pay in amplification of.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not quite the same with podcasting, but absolutely the commitment needs to be, if you're committing to produce, you absolutely have to commit to the distribution through aggregators, channels, the brand's own other marketing platforms, digital sports spend, to give the podcast every opportunity for maximum impact.
And so who's doing it well, Steve? And which brands are doing what makes a podcast stand out, and give us a couple of examples of ones that you think are doing well?
It's got to be something that is human, fundamentally.
Have a headline, right?
So, I think about some of the things I sort of listen to, and I know are widely listened to. So, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat is basically about this horrible word, work style. So work life, and what life is like in a job, what offices are like to work in, what technologies like to work with. So that is a great, fairly cerebral podcast for any B2B tech brand, business services company, design consultants. I mean, there's so many people that could have an interest in the content that goes into that podcast, but it's not branded content in the same way. It's independent. And then you look at branded content. So, okay, disclaimer: this is a Zeno and 3 Monkey Zeno client, but Gensler, it's a big architecture firm. It does some really interesting podcasts that look at office design, the built environment, how people work, how offices are changing, that kind of stuff. And it's not, it's credible. It's independent. It could be produced by a media company rather than an architecture company because it looks at human issues and has real life conversations in it. So those are kind of best practice. Again, Shopify is quite an interesting one. There's Sephora, the cosmetics company that has one around, what's that called? It's all around
the lip stories one.
Yeah, exactly. So that's of course that is a company that is producing lipstick, I believe. But it's quite a cute take on it, and that's part of the deal. That it's going to be to an extent self-serving, but it's doing it from a human storytelling perspective. Yeah,
absolutely, and it's influential female leaders who happen to be joined together by the medium of the lipstick and
exactly.
Sephora. It's quite clever. And going back to the Gensler, the architect, I mean, pre-podcasts, like we said earlier, that's very niche, right? So your only route to talking about what you're doing in any depth before a podcast is trade press, your own publication, I guess, advertorial, conference, stage time. Mm-hmm. This gives very niche industries, I guess, the possibility to reach audiences that they would have found harder in the.
Yeah, and I mean that's the case of actually something that is interesting, not just for people commissioning, design projects and moving offices and building offices and managing those budgets, but it's also interesting for anyone working in a company today or managing teams and thinking about, do we do fully open plan, do we do hot desking? Those kind of issues get discussed, but in a human way. So it actually has quite a broad appeal. But the interesting thing is that it's quite versatile, so it can do sort of spin-off content that is very niche and looks at one aspect of design or ergonomics or something in real detail for, again, to use the sweaty word, for people that really care about that stuff and they live and breathe it. So that, that flexibility is a really important thing. I think podcasts are kind of, developing as a platform with that kind of elasticity in ways that other media don't really allow.
So, if you were to give our listeners one takeaway on best practice and one big do, one big don't on podcasting, what would you say?
Don't produce as your default go-to. There's a lot of work to be done in auditing and understanding the market before you consider production. The do is to recognise the power and the impact of the spoken word in an on-demand environment and embrace it.
Okay. And Steve, what about you?
I think there's no one size fits all. You shouldn't just make a blanket recommendation, or as a brand think it's worked for someone else, it'll work for us. So to build on that, there's no one size fits all. But I think. Yeah, the other thing is that the spoken word, we've always known it's been hugely powerful in reputation storytelling for millennia, but technology is now just forcing us to think about it in different ways. And I think we're going to see a lot more focus on spoken word and reputation and innovation in the future.
Okay, cool. Good insights and great advice. Thank you both. And we got through our podcast about podcasting. So thank you both, Steve and Howard, for joining us in the Echo Chamber.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Echo Chamber. Brought to you by The Holmes Report and produced by Marketeers. Sponsored by The Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.